Welcome to the Marxist Workers Party's podcast, Izwi Labasebenzi, bringing reports and analysis of the news from a working class and Marxist perspective, fighting for jobs for all, a 12,500 Rand per month minimum wage and high-quality service delivery, organising to arm the workers and trade union movement with a revolutionary socialist and Marxist programme, building the struggle against capitalism and for working class political power and socialism.
The date is the 2nd of July 2021. In this bulletin, the third wave of COVID-19 sees the country return to lockdown level 4. Zuma is found guilty of contempt of court and sentenced to 15 months in prison. And instability deepens across southern Africa. On the 28th of June, the country re-entered lockdown level 4. The Delta variant of COVID-19 is driving a devastating third wave with a peak still some weeks ahead. New cases are being reported at double the rate of the previous two waves. Officially, 60,000 people have died in South Africa as a result of the pandemic. However, the more accurate excess death rate suggests the real figure may be as high as 173,000. In 2020, the economy shrank by an unprecedented 7% as a result of the lockdowns. Millions of jobs have been lost, pushing unemployment to an eye-watering 42%. The working class has faced extreme hardships piled on top of the existing disasters of unemployment and poverty. It is hard to imagine that after 15 months of the pandemic and lockdowns, the worst still lies ahead. The ANC government wasted the second half of 2020 dithering about their vaccine procurement policy. We covered this in a podcast number 5. But little progress has been made nearly a year later. Only 1% of the population has been fully vaccinated. In other words, received both jabs in the case of the Pfizer vaccine. Weeks into the first phase of the general rollout, only 40% of the over 60 age group have so far been vaccinated. Unsurprisingly, hospitals, especially in Gauteng, are filling up. There's a lack of beds, oxygen and ventilators. The media is filled with horror stories from health workers of the conditions they and their patients face. Despite it being obvious weeks ago that the slow pace of vaccine rollout would mean an inevitable third wave and the return to stricter lockdown, the ANC government has not prepared the country. They had other priorities. Unbelievably, in the middle of a major pandemic, the health minister has been suspended from his position because of corruption, joining 2 provincial health MECs who have also been removed. The ANC government has been so desperate to push ahead with their so-called economic reform program, involving massive public spending cuts and privatization, that they have undone many of the minimal measures previously introduced to manage the pandemic and mitigate the effects of the lockdown. The 350 social relief of distress grant, along with other top-up social welfare grants, have been cancelled, even as the country returns to level 4. No provisions have been made for the inevitable layoffs and job losses. The news that NEDLAC is discussing the reinstatement of the TERS program for furloughed workers came only after level 4 was announced. The refusal to fill vacancies in the public health sector has rendered the field hospitals set up in the first wave useless. There are still no staff to fill them. The Nasrec Field Hospital has been closed down. In Gauteng, the Charlotte Matlege Hospital remained closed after a fire even as the third wave grew in severity, despite the availability there of hundreds of beds. The mood of the working class entering this new hard lockdown is different from that which existed in the first 2 waves. Last year, there was a pragmatic resignation that begrudgingly gave the ANC government and the other capitalist politicians the benefit of the doubt. However, now it is clear that all of the hardships and suffering that were endured in the first two waves were for nothing. The third wave is here, and it is worse than the first two. There is a feeling that nothing made a difference, so why suffer through another lockdown? The EFF's rejection of the new lockdown and organisation of a misnamed March to Save Lives, whilst reckless and dangerous, is nevertheless a distorted reflection of the changed mood. The lurch back into level 4 in the face of a new, bigger and more deadly wave of infections has underlined the irreconcilability of the interests of the working class and the capitalist class. It is impossible to simultaneously defend the working class's living standards and health and the profit of the bosses. The decisions of the Coronavirus Command Council clearly prioritize the interests of the capitalist economy over the lives of the masses. The scientists pushing for the government response to be guided by science, in other words, the prioritization of the country's health, have been removed. Even the boss's newspaper, Business Day, is worried about where this road can lead. They devoted an editorial titled "Government Message to Workers on the Lockdown, You're on Your Own," raising a cautionary note about the social explosions the ANC government is preparing. It is entirely possible that there will be a resurgence of community protests in the coming weeks, especially if level 4 lockdown measures are extended beyond the initial 2 weeks. Unfortunately, in the trade union movement, the approach is business as usual. Even as anger surges, the SAFTU Trade Union Federation remains silent on the creation of a workers' party in its public statements, despite years-old resolutions committing it to help create one. If the ANC government has not prepared the country for the inevitable third wave, then we charge the trade union leaders with not preparing the working class. Instead, the SAFTU leadership, for example, has thumb-sucked a new magic number for an economic stimulus package. Now it is 1 trillion rand. Without linking this demand to nationalization, let alone to the socialist nationalization or democratic working class control, this is a proposal to hand the capitalist class a fortune and trust them to use it to the benefit of the working class. This government will never contemplate such a measure in any case. The unfolding disaster of the third wave confirms again the urgency of preparing the ground for the launch of a workers' party that sets itself the task of replacing the capitalist ANC government with a workers' government armed with a socialist program. We will return to the continuing struggle within SAFTU and around the Working Class Summit over the creation of a workers' party in future material.
On the 29th of June, the Constitutional Court found former President Jacob Zuma guilty of contempt of court. He has been sentenced to 15 months in prison without the possibility of appeal. Millions of working class people will have watched the judgment and thought it serves him right. Zuma's presidency was a disaster for the working class. Wedded to the capitalist policies, his government was completely incapable of addressing unemployment, poverty, or inequality. All these became worse under Zuma. While the working class and poor were suffering, Zuma and his clique spent their time looting public funds to enjoy lives of luxury. The latest price tag for the years of so-called state capture is a staggering 57 billion rands. This money should have been spent on jobs, wages, housing, education, health, and service delivery. The saber-rattling of Edward Zuma saying that they will have to, quote, kill him first, and Carl Niehaus calling for, quote, resistance by all, quotes, peace-loving South Africans, will likely just end in humiliating climb downs. The legal road to Zuma's imprisonment was opened up by his refusal at the end of last year to appear before the Zondo Commission. In February, the ConCourt issued an order compelling Zuma to appear. He not only refused the order, placing himself in direct confrontation with the so-called highest court in the land, but launched a propaganda campaign against the Zondo Commission, the ConCourt, and the entire judiciary. Zuma claimed he was being victimized and that both the commission and court had been, quote, politicized in an extension of the faction struggle in the ANC. Ultimately, Zuma's accusations and conduct challenged the entire post-apartheid political order. The agreement reached at CODESA, leading to the first democratic elections in 1994, struck a delicate balance for the future evolution of the ruling class. In exchange for the defense of capitalism and the wealth and property of the up-to-then white capitalist class, political power and control of the state would be handed to the black elite leading the ANC. The capitalist class would also be expected to make space for the development of black capitalists, or, in the words of Nelson Mandela, a quote, prosperous non-European bourgeoisie. In exchange, the ANC would protect capitalism from the working class, whose expectations of a rapid improvement in living standards was and is incompatible with the continuation of the capitalist profit system. Accordingly, COSATU was locked up in the tripartite alliance, its unconditional support for the ANC justified by the South African Communist Party's two-stage theory of revolution. But the CODESA agreement has come under growing strain since the 2009 world economic crisis. This opened a decade of economic stagnation in South Africa, a section of the aspirant black elite growing increasingly frustrated with the limitations displaced on their entry into the ruling class and the wealth they could accumulate, coalesced around the so-called state capture project during Zuma's presidency and now the so-called radical economic transformation faction. They are pushing for a decisive transfer of wealth from so-called white monopoly capital to themselves. The MWP has analyzed objective basis of the factional struggle within the ruling class extensively, most recently in our reply to City Press and in podcast number 3, both available on our website. The judgment of the ConCourt was absolutely scathing about Zuma's conduct and ripped to shreds the idea that he is a victim. Ultimately, the ConCourt judgment is a defense of the capitalist post-1994 political and economic order enshrined in the Constitution. This document assumes a capitalist economy in South Africa and defends its legal foundations in the defense of private property in the commanding heights of the economy. For the decisive section of the ruling class, the CODESA agreement has not yet exhausted its potential. Zuma got nowhere in 2018 when he tested out the willingness of the military to support his remaining in office after the ANC's decision to remove him. The ConCourt judgment is a warning to the different factions of the ruling class not to overreach themselves as Zuma and the RET faction did. In ruling that Zuma be jailed, they have sent a clear message. Even the head of state is not above the collective needs of the ruling class. In that sense, the judicial wing of the capitalist state has substituted itself as the ruling class executive committee, given the paralysis of the executive and legislative wings as a result of the factional divisions in the ANC. The judgment has sent the liberal middle class in the media, the NGOs and so-called civil society into fits of euphoria. It is being heralded as a triumph of the rule of law, an end to the quote age of impunity, and a watershed in the development of quote of our democracy. Some are so triumphant that they are proclaiming the superiority of South African democracy and the South African Constitution over the old Western democracies. Yet the ConCourt class character has been reaffirmed in the judgment in favor of Ramaphosa, on the matter of the donation by the notoriously corrupt Bosasa company. Its CEO donated 500,000 to Ramaphosa's watches to win the 2017 ANC presidential election campaign. The judgment effectively reaffirms Ramaphosa's right to so-called privacy over the identity of his donors, and the records will remain sealed. The ANC itself has maintained a deafening silence over revelations that raising funds for internal campaigns was prohibited until 2012, when the relevant clause disappeared from the ANC's constitution without the matter being discussed by delegates. The working class has its own experience of South Africa's capitalist democracy. The MWP has recently drawn attention to the deeply political anti-working class rulings of the courts. For example, in podcast number 5 and the latest issue of our Izwi Labasebenzi magazine. Last year, the Labour Appeal Court upheld the ANC government's cancellation of agreed public sector pay increase. They ruled that the original wage agreement was unconstitutional, in effect, because it contradicted the overarching government policy of spending cuts and austerity. Before that, the dismissal of over 700 workers at Avang Steel was upheld by no less than the Constitutional Court itself on the grounds of the employer's, quote, declining profits. The courts, with the ConCourt as final arbiter, are responsible for upholding the anti-strike amendments introduced into the Labour Relations Act in 2015. These judgments, the Zuma ruling, and the clearing of Ramaphosa of any wrongdoing around the Bosasa donation are all calculated to bring some stability to South African capitalism on the terms of the capitalist class. After a number of internal party victories and the aid of the courts, Ramaphosa clearly has the upper hand in the factional struggle within the ANC. The threat of a split has receded for now. However, this will do little to stop the electoral decline of the ANC. This is rooted in the economic impasse of South African capitalism, to which the ruling class has no answers. It would also be a mistake to think that the ANC's factionalism and the threat of the damaging splits which inevitably accompanies it can never be overcome. This too is rooted in capitalism's crisis, to which has now been added the economic ruin brought by the COVID-19 pandemic. Even if the RT faction in its current form were to be decisively defeated, it would simply re-emerge in new forms. The working class has nothing to celebrate in the ascendancy of the Ramaphosa faction. The so-called reform agenda he will pursue on behalf of the ruling party means massive cuts to public spending, a tax on pay, and the privatization of state-owned enterprises. This is what the ConCourt blow to Zuma and clearing of Ramaphosa is opening the way for. The working class must fiercely assert its independence from all the factions of the ruling class. There is no lesser devil. We face one class enemy. Marxists analyze the ruling class's faction struggles in order to understand how to exploit these divisions, arming the working class to gain ground in the class struggle. For the working class, the Zuma judgment and all the drama around the ANC's factions, just like the surging third wave of the pandemic, underlines again the need to build a socialist mass workers' party to replace the ANC and the parties of capital with a workers' government able to implement a socialist program.
The crisis of capitalism, exacerbated by the pandemic, is being reflected across the Southern African region. As we publish this podcast, mass protests have erupted in eSwatini. Protesters are demanding democratic rights and an end to the rule of the absolute monarch, King Mswati III. The capitalist dictator with economic interest in every corner of the eSwatini economy is linked by 1,000 threads to the ruling elites across the region, including the capitalist class in South Africa. Mswati has been propped up by the ANC ruling elite, including even through marriages. The dressing up of his dictatorship in so-called traditional African tribal clothes fools no one. The masses of eSwatini must have no illusions in the neighboring governments or in SADC. Depending on the development of the protests, they may eventually pressure Mswati to step aside and for democratic reforms to be instituted. But they will carefully attempt to manage the process to protect capitalism in eSwatini and their own business interests. In Lesotho, huge strikes in the garment industry have taken place in recent weeks as workers are pushed into struggle as a result of the pandemic's economic effects. On June 23rd, SADC agreed to the development of a so-called standby force mission into the northern Cabo Delgado province of Mozambique. This is the belated response of the regional elites to an armed insurgency that has been underway there since October 2017. In 2020 alone, there were 570 violent incidents in Cabo Delgado. Nearly 3,000 people have died so far, and over 700,000 have been displaced. Atrocities against the local population are being committed by both the insurgents and the Mozambican army and security forces. But the military intervention under the command of the corrupt government in Maputo and the elites of the SADC countries will only add to the suffering. Capitalism has led the entire southern African region into a dead end. Only the working class can lead it out in a struggle for socialism. The building of mass parties of the working class, drawing behind them the unemployed, the poor and small farmers, is a task posed in every country of the region.
If you have any questions or comments about the contents of this bulletin, please let us know, and we may try and respond in future bulletins. Also, if you know about or are involved in any struggles you would like us to report on, whether that is in your workplace, your community, your university, college or school, or have any suggestions of future topics that you would like us to cover, please contact us. The Marxist Workers Party is an affiliate of the Committee for a Workers' International, the CWI, building global working class unity in the struggle for a socialist South Africa, a socialist Africa, and a socialist world. If you would like to join the Marxist Workers Party or find out more about us, including building the CWI in Southern Africa, please visit our website at www.marxistworkersparty.org.za, find us on Facebook and Twitter, or call or WhatsApp us on 081 366 7375.